He left too soon. And yet, all he ever wanted was to leave a mark that would last forever. On an otherwise ordinary day in 1973, Bobby Darin went in for a routine dental checkup. It was supposed to be quick and uneventful, just a simple examination. But fate had other plans. Panic followed. A rushed hospitalization. Doctors fighting desperately to save him. And then came the calls, the kind that shatter everything. At 37 years old, Bobby Darin was gone. Not on stage, not in the spotlight, but in a hospital room suddenly and almost absurdly. Yet when you look closer, it becomes clear. He had always lived on the edge, because he knew his time was limited. His life was a flash, dazzling, intense, and heartbreakingly short. Born on May 14, 1936, the world came to know him as Bobby Darin. But his real name was Walden Robert Casado. He was just 8 years old when doctors delivered a grim diagnosis: rheumatic fever. Not once, but multiple times, each episode chipping away at his heart. They told him he wouldn't live long, and somehow that warning etched itself into his soul. He grew up in the Bronx, surrounded by narrow streets and even narrower family secrets. Everyone in his home knew the truth. The boy was sick, so they spoiled him as best they could, called him the king, granted every wish, as if tomorrow might not come. He became used to being the center of attention, adored, protected, but also withdrawn, focused inward. Death had been a shadow behind him since childhood, and he could feel it. Maybe that's why he understood so early. If you're going to live, live brightly. If you're going to love, love desperately. And if you're going to leave a legacy, make it unforgettable. He didn't just dream of fame, he needed it like air. Bobby was gifted. A brilliant student, though often mocked by classmates. Always the outsider, always a little too fragile. That's when he found refuge in music. Not just as a hobby, but as a way of being. Singing made him feel alive. Applause meant he belonged. He didn't just want to be someone. He had to be. Music had been his dream since he was young. But the road to the stage began with small, unlikely steps. Even his name, in a way, was an accident. Something he once claimed to have spotted on a mailbox or sign. Something that sounded star-worthy. And so, Bobby Darin was born. A boy with a damaged heart and an unrelenting hunger for immortality. His journey had only just begun. But even then, he knew. An ordinary life was never an option. In a Chinese restaurant, a window sign bore a glaring typo. Instead of advertising Mandarin Duck, it proclaimed Darin Duck. A twist of fate? Quite fitting, because the life of Bobby Darin, mockingly nicknamed Darin Duck, also began in a tangle of confusion, false starts, and near misses. He threw himself headlong into music, yet the stage seemed determined to reject him. One flop after another followed. Records that sold scarcely a copy, audiences that sat in silence. Still, he refused to quit. Stubborn, alive, always pushing against the tide. He listened, learned, experimented, and never lost sight of his one aim: to break through. Then, in 1958, that relentless drive finally found its voice. A song emerged, light, catchy, almost childlike, called Splish Splash. It sold in the millions like a lightning strike, transforming yesterday's failure into today's star. But Darin was not content to rest on his laurels. He hungered for more. New sounds, bold partnerships, greater heights. Fate led him to a young singer named Connie Francis. Neither was yet a legend, but both felt the thrilling roar of applause and the echo of fame. Together, they burned like gasoline on a lit match. Instant, dazzling, and impossible to ignore. At first, they simply wrote songs side by side. Soon, they were living nearly inseparable lives. Connie would later confess that Bobby was the love of her life, and even caught him in a bed with two women without batting an eye, because he was Bobby. Audacious, unpredictable, utterly magnetic. He wanted to marry her, urged her to run away with him into the unknown. But one barrier stood in the way: her father. Stern, domineering, he despised Darin with every fiber. When he nearly came to blows with Bobby, Connie made her choice. She stayed with her father, and Bobby was left with heartbreak. That pain only fueled his ambition. Bobby Darin aspired to be more than just a singer. He dreamed of becoming an era. He spent countless hours in the studio, perfecting every chord, every whispered breath into the microphone, driving each song toward absolute perfection. His perfectionism became legendary, for he longed above all else to be legendary himself. Yet with fame came its shadow. Success, like a magnifying glass, amplified both his gifts and his flaws. He could be arrogant, vain, and though he counted titans among his acquaintances, he sometimes lost friends along the way. In 1956, he made his television debut on the Dorsey Brothers show, a milestone that marked both the start of his triumph and the beginning of his solitude. For to be Bobby Darin was to sing, to love, to fall, to rise, and never to be fully understood. He burst into show business like a storm, confident, brash, dazzling. Bobby Darin seemed like the kind of man who always got what he wanted, even if it meant stepping on a few toes along the way. He was a star and he knew it, but the higher he climbed, the lonelier it got at the top. Even his friends began to grow weary of his ego. One of them, none other than Sammy Davis Jr., a legend in his own right, finally had enough. With frustration, he told Darin, "Let me know when you're done being a legend, and maybe we can be friends again." Then he walked out of Bobby's life. Many, like Sammy, began to distance themselves, tired of the arrogance. But there were others who saw something different behind the showman's facade. George Burns, the beloved comedian who had given Darin his very first break on stage, sensed there was something fragile underneath all the noise. As Darin's circle grew smaller, he began spending more and more time with Burns, almost as if searching for the warmth of a father figure he'd never truly had. Over time, their bond became deeply personal, almost familial. Then tragedy struck. In 1964, George Burns lost his wife, the love of his life. He was devastated, and it was Bobby who showed up. Not for publicity, not for performance, just to be there. For several nights, he stayed with Burns, sleeping in the same room so his friend wouldn't be alone. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. Burns would later call him a miracle, not for himself but for others, because Bobby had made a habit of hiding his own demons in the dark, where no one could see. But that was just one side of Bobby Darin. His energy couldn't be contained by a single career. After conquering television, he set his sights on the movies, and dove in headfirst. One of his first major film roles came in Come September, where he starred opposite Sandra Dee, the very picture of innocence, like a dream girl lifted straight from a department store window. For Darin, this wasn't just another job. He fell hard. He called it a magnetic pull. But Sandra remembered it differently. She found him arrogant and self-absorbed. She wanted nothing to do with him. But Bobby wasn't one to take no for an answer. So he tried another approach through her mother. With her help, he arranged their first real date. A horse-drawn carriage ride, the stuff of old Hollywood romance. And somehow it worked. His sincerity, what was hidden beneath the glitter, began to reach her. Sandra started to soften. Something real began to bloom. They fell in love. Loudly, naively, completely. Their flirtation echoed across the set. By December of 1960, they were already talking marriage. And 1 year later, in December of 1961, their son was born, Dodd Mitchell Darin. It seemed like a fairy tale come true. The house, the family, the love. But in Hollywood, fairy tales have a way of breaking. What began as magic slowly, painfully came undone. Little Dodd grew up in a home where love was often buried beneath exhaustion, and happiness gave way to quiet storms behind closed doors. And yet, in the middle of that chaos, there was Bobby Darin, a man who loved wildly, suffered silently, and no matter what life threw his way, still found a way to be a miracle. At least for someone. The house of Darin and Dee still echoed with laughter. The lights of lavish parties still flickered into the night. But the golden days were already slipping away. No one dared say it aloud, but something had changed. Darin, blinded by the dazzle of his own success, kept living in the rhythm of show business. Cocktails, applause, the endless hum of admiration. He believed his wife would always be by his side, radiant, smiling, effortlessly playing the part of the star in his orbit. What he failed to notice was how often Dee had begun to fall silent. Years later, their son would say that his father expected his mother to be a permanent fixture at parties, an ever-charming companion, flawless when needed. But Dee had grown tired of being an accessory in someone else's spotlight. She was fading into the background of a show she hadn't signed up to star in. Darren was vanishing more and more after his performances, swept away by boisterous late nights with friends, while Dee stayed behind, waiting, aching, slowly losing hope. Loneliness became her shadow. In that quiet prison, she reached for anything that offered temporary relief, a habit not easily broken. Their marriage, once a bond between two beautiful, powerful, deeply in love people, began to crumble. Arguments turned into weapons, silences into walls. They seemed to compete in who could hurt the other more. Dee, exhausted from constant criticism, began to strike back, mocking Darren's appearance, making snide comments before his broadcasts, even teasing him about his hair being out of place. Darren, eaten away by jealousy, began to suspect Dee of flings with colleagues. After all, their own love had sparked on a set. One film in particular, Tammy and the Doctor with Peter Fonda, haunted him. He couldn't shake the anxiety. In 1963, it reached a boiling point. Darren told Dee he wanted a divorce. The reason was flimsy, the jealousy baseless, but the wound it left was real. Dee was stunned. She couldn't believe their story would end this way, so abruptly, so senselessly. There were late-night talks, tears, and attempts to understand each other. They agreed to try again. Darren made an effort. He softened, stayed close, spent more time with their son, tried to be a husband instead of a jealous man. But the specter of doubt still lingered. Even a simple conversation between Dee and Warren Beatty at a party could send Darren into a storm. He was unraveling. He didn't know how to stop himself from destroying everything all over again. And so, as often happens, he chose to run. Darren couldn't bring himself to tell Dee it was truly over, so he asked his psychiatrist to do it for him. That was how it ended. Quietly, bitterly, finally. What came next would be the hardest year of Darren's life, 1968. A time when he tried to redefine himself, to become something more than an actor. He stepped into politics, believing in the promise of change. He joined Robert Kennedy's presidential campaign and forged a true friendship with him. For Darren, Kennedy became more than a politician. He was a symbol of hope, a personal hero, someone who gave meaning back to the world. And for a while, that meaning made everything feel whole again. But as so often happens, the brighter the light, the more sudden the darkness. In the glittering wake of fame, Bobby Darin carried with him a grief that no spotlight could soften. When he boarded a plane with Robert F. Kennedy on that fateful journey, he didn't yet know he was among the last to see the senator alive. After the assassination, the world reeled, but Darin unraveled. Something in him broke. He clung to the coffin on the eve of the burial, sitting through the night like a man unable to let go of the light that once gave him purpose. But grief has a way of peeling back more than sorrow. That same year, another blow landed, this one closer to home. A secret unraveled like a thread tugged loose from the very fabric of his identity. Bobby Darin, the boy who believed his grandmother was his mother, learned that the truth was far more tangled. His real mother, Nina, had been only 17 when she gave birth. To shield the family from shame, she raised him as her brother. The revelation shattered him. The ground beneath his life, already shaken by loss, seemed to vanish entirely. There was no clear answer to the question that now burned in his chest. Who was my father? And the silence that met him only deepened his ache. Even as he poured himself into his music, the heart beneath his stage persona had always been fragile. It had beat unevenly since childhood. Physically, yes, but emotionally too. By the 1970s, his heart, both literal and figurative, was failing. His marriage to Sandra Dee had unraveled, leaving him hollow and adrift. And yet, even after all their pain, Sandra couldn't turn away from him in his decline. She stayed, watching as he grew paler, weaker. But love comes in strange forms and second chances. In 1970, Darren met Andrea Yeager, not a Hollywood starlet, but a modest, kind-hearted secretary. Friends called her genuine, someone who wanted nothing from Bobby but Bobby himself. It was enough. He fell fully again. The following year, after battling through the fog of medication and illness, he underwent risky heart surgery to implant an artificial valve. It was a grueling operation, and recovery didn't come easy. But when he opened his eyes, he tried once more to chase life. He returned to the stage, oxygen tanks often waiting in the wings. Andrea stayed close, her quiet devotion keeping him afloat. By the summer of 1973, they exchanged vows. A quiet ceremony, a whisper of hope. But hope, too, can be fragile. Just 4 months later, the strain of his worsening health frayed the marriage at its edges. Andrea, loving but worn, walked away. Darren, still only 37, faced his second divorce and the cruel weight of another ending. And then, the final misstep. A dental appointment, a forgotten dose of antibiotics. It seemed small, even trivial, but for a man with a vulnerable heart, it was deadly. Infections spread like fire in dry grass, and soon sepsis consumed what strength he had left. On December 11, 1973, Bobby checked into the hospital for one last surgery. He never awoke. 37 years old, silenced in the quiet of the recovery room. Even after death, tragedy lingered like a shadow. Decades later, in 2008, a fire at Universal Studios consumed the master recordings of hundreds of artists, including Darren's. The physical remnants of his voice, his music, his legacy, gone in smoke. But stories endure where even records don't. In time, Bobby's son grew up and took the reins of remembrance. He poured his energy into a tribute, a musical titled Dream Lover. It wasn't just a celebration of Darren's songs. It was an elegy to the man behind the fame, the fragile boy, the wounded soul, the searching heart. Through heartbreak and revelation, through grief and brief flashes of joy, Bobby Darin lived fast and felt deeply. His story, like his music, hums with both light and sorrow, a melody unfinished, but never forgotten.